Welcome to my session on moving towards proficiency. My name is Jaworski, and I am a Spanish teacher in the Virginia Beach City Public Schools, and I'm broadcasting here from Ocean Lakes High School, right here in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And I just want to ask one more time, does everybody hear me? Great. I'm seeing responses coming in right now saying that you can hear me, which is a good thing. And I understand at certain points I can click on a microphone over here to hear you all if you raise your hand and want to chime in verbally. And otherwise, I can see the comments on the screen and I can address them accordingly as well. So before we even delve into this session, I always like to think about what inspired me to dedicate my professional life to share the ability to communicate in somebody else's native language. So I want you to just take a moment, and you don't have to necessarily share it out loud unless you want to, which is what inspired you to dedicate your professional life to share the ability to communicate in somebody else's language. What's that again?
You start your webcam.
Yeah, it's on.
Start sharing. There you go.
There we go. So everybody can see me, right? Okay, great. Apparently I didn't start my webcam, so it started now. So think about what inspired you to dedicate your professional life to share the ability to communicate in someone else's native language, I should say. I think most of you are probably thinking along the lines of the fact that you enjoy languages. Perhaps it's that you maybe come from a background, and I'm seeing comments such as you fell in love with the language in Spanish 1, which kind of happened with me as well. I always remember when I was in the 8th grade, I took my first level of Spanish, which was Spanish 1, and I had never really been in a household that spoke Spanish. In fact, my family was from Poland, so my grandmother would always say, why are you learning Spanish when you should be learning Polish? Well, Spanish was what was relevant for me at the time, and so that's what did it for me. And of course, I had a great teacher, my first year, that just really made me want to keep learning it. So everybody has a story, and everybody has a reason why they went into languages. This session is going to kind of hit it on that aspect as well, because a lot of times it's when we have a purpose to learn something that we pursue that. So the targets for this session will be: I can prepare my students for language and cultural encounters outside the classroom. I can facilitate purposeful communication. I can expand on practices that support language learning for world readiness. So I'm talking about not so much what's the language use in the classroom, but how do we prepare them for that language use outside the classroom, because that's going to look different from what sometimes occurs in the classroom. And so we're going to delve into how do we make it look more like what we do outside of our classroom. The essential questions for this session will be: how do students increase proficiency for target language and cultural encounters outside of the classroom? How do we prepare students for language use outside the classroom? And how do we build a learning environment that encourages meaningful student communication, creativity, and risk-taking? And that's a real important aspect, is that risk-taking aspect. So, before we even get too far into this, we need to ask ourselves, what is communication? And I know most of us will think to ourselves, well, it's interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational, which is correct. Bill Van Patten's definition: communication is the expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning with a purpose in a given context. So we have to have context, we have to have purpose, we have to have negotiation of meaning, we have to have interpretation, and of course, expression. So, and you can see the three modes in that definition there. So, I guess going back to that definition, what will students encounter outside my classroom? And these are what the things they will encounter outside the classroom, which has that implication of we're going to be going from a rehearsed to unrehearsed, because students won't always get to rehearse what they do outside their classroom. So take a minute, and what I would like you to do, and if you have people in your room, you can talk for a minute on this and type your answers. What does proficiency look like to you? What does proficiency look like? So I'm going to give you a minute to talk about that. I call it coffee talk. Okay, you can keep typing your responses. I see from Fairfax that spontaneously can communicate their message or idea. Longwood, spontaneous conversation with a purpose. Washington and Lee, being able to use the language with native speakers with no problems of communication. These are great answers y'all are giving. Very good. I like that because you're hitting on those key points, which are the purpose and the spontaneous, the unrehearsed, and of course the negotiation of meaning. That's really key to the communication aspect. So, so if you think about it in terms of language is similar to any other skill in the sense that, you know, what does it mean to be proficient at riding a bike? What does being able to ride a bike look like? Playing tennis, and one of my favorite pastimes is ballroom dancing. And you know, when I learn how to ballroom dance, we usually start out with a rehearsed formulaic dance step, a dance routine. So we'll have like an amalgamation that we keep doing over and over again. Then we put it to music and we dance it some more. And then the instructor, you know, when you go out to a dance party, you can do that again, but then you might hit some obstacles when you go to a dance party because there are other people from other backgrounds that are dancing on the same dance floor as you, so floorcraft comes into play. And that becomes a point where you have to be careful you don't run into somebody else on the dance floor, so you have to be more aware of your surroundings. So I see that similar to language learning in the sense that we go from that formulaic to that non-formulaic. So, so when you hear someone talk about proficiency, you won't hear them say, "I'm giving up because it's hard." People don't give up riding a bicycle. So, would you say that being proficient? Would you say that being proficient at using language requires a learner to speak and write perfectly? Would be a question that you would want to think about, and we're going to hit on that in a second. So if we believe that, you know, proficiency is something that you grow into over time, then what we're doing in our classroom is going to be sequential in that sense as well. So what you see in your classroom is going to be what you would see out in the real world. So I would say proficiency is independent use of language by the learner. So our goal is to provide learners with independent use of language through meaningful classroom practice. And when I say independent, that doesn't mean talking by themselves, but being able to do it eventually without all of the scaffolding. So it's knowing when to scaffold and when not to scaffold. I'm going to progress to the next slide. Okay, and I'm just going to check the messages here. I see feel comfortable expressing self with native speakers, negotiation of meaning, to support, sustain the language, the target language consistently, creating unplanned conversation to get a point across, thinking in that language. These are great answers. I love everything that you all are saying. Very nice. And of course, ODU with the comment, great metaphor, that fantastic, thanks. So let's look at the path, a brief look at the path to proficiency. So we see these, going from words, going to phrases, going to sentences. So you see the progression, and I can tell from the group that I have, the answers I'm seeing, you're already familiar with this. So novice learners, they need to practice using memorized language to express personal meaning. They need to be asking questions, so they'll start with memorized questions, and it's okay to start memorized. And they're eventually going to be not memorized. They're going to ask questions that follow up on what a partner said. And this is in the novice level. You'll see producing sentences, and they might be putting it together with memorized chunks of language, showing some self-correcting as they progress. There'll be some self-correction. And this is one of the things I always say is it's all formulaic until it's no longer formulaic. So it's all formulaic until it's not. And I think that's an important part, because that formulaic piece does occur maybe multiple times throughout their path to proficiency. Keeping in mind, when we look at proficiency targets, we need to also be aware of how long does it take to get to these targets, moving from novice to intermediate. Because I know that when language programs are establishing these learning targets, they need to take into account what is a key factor in that. And one of the things that I'll mention is the time that you spend on that language. So approximately 75 hours of language learning is required in order to move up to the next proficiency level. And so you're thinking like you're going from a novice low to a novice mid, that's 75 hours. To get them up to a novice high, 75 more hours, you're looking at 150 hours of language learning time going on to get to that. So that's important information for us to remember as we establish our proficiency targets and what we're doing. So take a moment, and this is a really important aspect of language learning, is the accuracy piece. So linguistic accuracy is important when communicating. Do you agree with that statement or not? And take a moment to talk amongst yourselves if you're in a room with people, and record, if you can share your thoughts on that for a minute with all of us on the screen, type them in. So I'll give you a minute to talk about that. Okay, I see some great answers again. Spontaneity is key for proficiency. Agree. Disagree, we can get our point across without being 100% grammatically correct. Errors may be weak or strong. If they impede meaning, then corrective feedback may be needed, but error correction shouldn't interfere with the flow of thought. I'm loving these answers because you're hitting on the points that I would like to make. Great, disagree, because you can use gestures to help communicate through language. This is very important because when we talk about accuracy, we're not talking about your starting point. And anytime you're talking about building towards proficiency, you can't be starting with accuracy because of the fact that errors are obligatory. When you're learning how to ride a bicycle, you have to have training wheels. When they take the training wheels off, there's going to be wobbling, there's going to be falling, there's going to be... Same thing with babies when they're learning how to walk. They fall down frequently. And these errors are obligatory for them to be able to learn how to walk and eventually run. So I love the answers that you all gave. And I think that's an important point that Loudon Valley brings up with the it depends on the type of error, because at the same time, we don't want them to solidify an error that impedes comprehensibility. So they want to be understood because it's very important that they be understood, and the greater the amount of accuracy, the greater of a chance that they will be understood. So we don't totally write off accuracy, but we acknowledge the fact that it's not our starting point when we're talking about a long path to proficiency, because this takes a long time. So errors are definitely obligatory in the process, and in fact, my students will always say, los errores son obligatorios. Or if I say, los errores son, my students will always finish my sentence, obligatorios, because it's important that students know this, because we talk about we want students to be able to risk take, but if they can't get over this fact that they need to make mistakes, that mistakes are normal, mistakes are good, we learn from making mistakes, then they're willing to take more risks. And you'll see that the students, and I can tell you all see this because of the answers you're giving, you see these things always in your own classrooms, that the kids who understand these principles are the rooms where you'll see more risk taking. And that's why I think it's important that we share these principles with our students. And again, having proper proficiency targets on our learning plans is really important. And you know, like I said, the 75 hours it takes to get to a novice mid-level, the 75 additional at least, totaling 150 to get to a novice mid-level is an important factor to remember as we establish those targets and have these principles in place to get us to where we want to be. And if you're talking about a Category 4 language like Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, those take 3 times as long to achieve the same level of proficiency, according to a recent session that I attended with that Greg Duncan had presented at ACTFL. And so the same level of proficiency as one learning in a Category 1 or 2 language is going to be set at a target 1 sub-level lower than, say, a Roman alphabetic language. And so it's important that we have appropriate targets set for whichever languages that we teach, and that the students understand the principles to our approach to learning a language. And I'll share with you all in a minute how my students know that. So I loved this comic strip that I stumbled across. If you can see it from your screens, where there's a bunch of red marks on the paper. So I think from the illustration you can see that language is a problem there. But in our classes, we don't want language to be the problem. We want it to be the solving tool. So language is used to solve problems. It's not used, it should not be the problem. Because we don't want to stifle our students. And, you know, one of the things I would say is, can a student still communicate a subjunctive thought without knowing the subjunctive mood? It's an interesting question, you know, and it's a question that even in an upper level class you could pose to an upper level class, knowing that they may know how to use the subjunctive mood. So for example, even in an advanced placement class, you might want to pose a phrase like, I'm not going to go unless you go, which in a Spanish language classroom would require the use of the subjunctive and maybe the word unless. And ask them, how would somebody who doesn't know the word unless express the thought, I'm not going unless you go? And of course this would be in the target language. No voy a menos que tú vayas. Is there a way to say, no voy a menos que tú vayas? I'm not going unless you go, without saying unless. So students can, as just an exercise in circumlocution, they could even think, I don't know, you know, I'm going if you go. So there's multiple ways to say the same thing, and this can be illustrated on a regular basis in all classes. So I think it's great. You know, one of the things, like if a student is speaking in the target language and then they slip in the middle of the sentence and they fill in an English word with that word, you know, don't acknowledge that English word. You know, ask them, what is, and then state that word. So if they're like babbling on in their language, in the target language, and then they come to that word and they're like, rocking chair, and you're like, ¿qué es rocking chair? So then they have to describe to you what that is. You know, it gets them used to having to say things they don't know how to say, because most likely that's how they're going to encounter it outside your classroom. Most of the time they're going to not know how to say what they want to know how to say, so they need that type of exposure and practice in their classrooms. And this is why they also need to know the process. So in, you know, one of the things that I post in my classroom is this right here, language learners enduring understandings. And I think it's important that the students are aware of what is the process. So it's an ongoing process. It's language learning it opens doors obviously to other cultures. So they're going to be able to meet other people that they would have not met otherwise. It requires them to solve problems. Again, I'm going back to it's not the problem of this classroom. The language of this classroom is used to solve problems. There are multiple ways to say the same thing, which I highlighted a minute ago with the unless example. And then, of course, we already talked about accuracy. Accuracy is a destination. It's not the starting point. So these are the ones, you know, these are the principles that I use to guide my approach. And I'm not the originator of these thoughts. A lot of these thoughts come from multiple sessions I've been to, from D'Amato, and these are the principles that I know probably all of you all are following out in your own classrooms. That language is primarily self-selected and it's not imitated. So students will use what they need. So we need to be giving them what they need, not what they do not need. And again, it's something that really, if you think about it, we don't teach language, we facilitate language. So, and I think that it's important that the students, again, understand this as they progress in the classroom. And of course, you know, just because they may be a novice thinker does not mean, or I should say a novice speaker, does not mean that they're novice thinkers. So just because they're a novice speaker does not mean that their thinking has to remain novice. So this is why they need to be able to circumlocute and be able to find another way to say what they're saying on a regular basis in our classrooms. So my question for all of you, and I'm going to give you all time to talk and even ask me questions. If you have any questions, feel free to chime in, because I can see whenever you're commenting out there. What motivates students to learn? Or better stated, what motivates students to keep learning a second language? And the reason I want to say keep learning a second language is because the continuity of study is so important to this. This is not something you give up on. Nobody ever says, I'm not going to talk because I make mistakes. So when we first learned as babies, we spoke. So what's going to keep our students taking our languages? So what motivates students to keep learning a second language? So I'm going to mute my microphone for a minute and let you all, if you're in groups where you can talk to others, you can do that for a minute, and then type your responses. Okay, so I'm already seeing some answers. Relevancy to their environment and interests. And I'll give time for others to chime in if they would like. Okay, let's see here, whoops. Okay, I'm seeing some other ones. Okay, I already mentioned relevancy to their environment and interest and a willingness to know more, travel to other countries, learn about other cultures. Students are motivated by things which are relevant and meaningful to them, use authentic resources, which we're going to hit on in a minute. They also may want to learn the language because there's family connection. Others are motivated because they love the culture. Let me scroll here. Culture of that language. So these are some really great answers, and I think all of them, there's really no wrong answer to that other than the fact that it is something I see interest as a driving point of this. I can see in all of the answers there is basically the student interest, and I would say almost like student purpose. This next slide is my favorite slide. There we go, yes. And I'm going to, this is a slide that I made about 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, and I pulled it from one of my first presentations that I did at FLAVA, and the person who helped me with that was Shirley Hall. So thank you, Shirley Hall, for your help on that slide. It's one of my favorites, and I keep it keeps popping up in presentations because it's one of my favorite points is the purpose. And you know, what is purpose? Well, I would say what makes it real world. What is purpose? The purpose is not the language. I noticed in your answers the purpose wasn't necessarily the language itself, but I was hearing things like culture, travel, interests. So those were the things that were the purpose for the language piece. So, so the tasks that we want our students engaged in are ones that have a purpose, because that's what motivates them, that they want to learn. So I always ask myself, do students have a real reason to engage in the reading that we're doing? Do they have a real reason to engage in the listening that we're doing? Do they have a real reason to engage in the speaking that we're doing? Do they have a real reason to engage in the writing that we're doing? So, you know, how will this strengthen their conceptual understanding and build discipline, appropriate ways of thinking? So, you know, the opposite of students learning language with a purpose would be for them to learn it without a purpose, which would not make any sense. So I think that this ties into the authentic piece. But before I hit on the authentic piece, you know, if there's a purpose, they're going to continue studying the language in our classes. And I think this is important because what we do in our classes could be the biggest advocacy piece that for continuity of study and for language learning. So I just, and I had Shirley Hall just go over and pull this off my wall, which I'll have to put back up after this session, but one of the things I have posted in my room, because I'm broadcasting from my classroom, is, I'm sure most of you have seen this, it's the oral proficiency levels in the workplace. And if students are aware of the oral proficiency levels in the workplace, this in itself can also be something that will motivate them for that goal of oral proficiency. So if you look at that, you can't see it from there, but I'm just going to highlight it very quickly, is the fact that in the intermediate, mid, and high levels, cashier, sales clerk, receptionist, highly predictable contexts, firefighter, utilities installer, auto inspector. So you don't really see any corresponding professions or positions until they're up into that intermediate range, which would beg the question of why would a student want to go 3 years then stop? It wouldn't make sense. They're going to make more money if they have a seal of biliteracy. They're going to make more money if they're able to go to that job interview and say, yes, I am just as qualified as these other candidates. However, I have one additional skill, which is I can communicate in 2 languages. So these are the things that we always want to make our students aware of as they're in our classes. So when we talk about the authentic piece, first of all, what makes it real? What makes it real? Well, we need to know what real is. Let's define what real is. Well, real is for pleasure. So, you know, it has to be, like, for example, for some students it might be reading media gossip about a pop star, or the synopsis of a movie, or maybe synopsis of a video game, short stories, magazine articles, or anything of interest that they might find online, or whatever, you know, media they choose for pleasure. Life tasks. So, you know, it could be something such as looking for information. It could be buying something. So depending on what the age is. So of course the life tasks would have to be age appropriate. So you're not going to have, you know, 5th graders making an airline reservation. because most fifth graders don't make reservations to go on a flight. So we want to make sure that it's age appropriate. Otherwise, it won't be meaningful to them, whereas maybe in a different age group it would be. So it's important for us to take into mind what is authentic. So when we talk about making it real, we also want to ask what is authentic. So if we define authentic, authentic is something that is a source that is created by a native speaker for a native speaker. So if it's not created for a native speaker, then of course we're talking about something that's not authentic any longer. It could be semi-authentic, maybe a native speaker made it for a non-native. But we want, and there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not our end. Our end is that we want the students to be able to interact with authentic materials, authentic text. And when I talk about text, I'm not talking about just listening and reading. Text is anything that could be from the five senses. So it's what you touch, it's what you smell, it's what you taste, it's what you hear. So text can be anything that our five senses can perceive. And again, that authentic piece is very important. So that's what activates authentic communication, is authentic, real world realia. Okay, and that goes for the situations as well. So the situations that we give our students. So the question I would ask is the communication they're learning in our classes required? Is it required for functioning outside of our classroom? Because that's an important piece in all of that. So let's move on to the next slide. How do students encounter language in the world? Well, we know they don't encounter it by vocabulary tests. We know they don't really encounter it by producing memorized dialogue. We know they don't encounter it by necessarily just translating sentences. But we do see that they'll encounter it by making plans to do something, by solving a problem, by completing a project. These are the things that they'll do it. And sometimes sometimes it's the unpracticed target language that's worth more than the practiced. So it's that collaboration that they do in the classroom that's more important. So, when I say, well, we don't want them to do memorized dialogues, that's true, because they're not going to be doing memorized dialogues when they're outside the classroom. One of my classes many years ago had said, but they wanted to do like a skit. They wanted to do something fun. They thought a skit was fun. So I thought, but I didn't want that to be the goal. So I negotiated with them, and I let them do a skit, but it was under this condition. They had to do all the collaboration and planning of their little presentation that they wanted to create and present to their colleagues or classmates. But I told them it had to be 100% in the target language, all collaboration, 100% in the target language. So their grade wasn't the actual skit, but it was their collaboration, the non-rehearsed use of the target language. And that's not what I would say I do every time, but it just to illustrate that we need to make sure they're getting those opportunities and they understand that it's not the memorized language that's going to work for them outside the classroom. It's the having to produce with the language and having to circumlocute and having to solve problems with the language that's going to mimic what they'll really encounter outside in the real world. So again, in order for language to grow towards proficiency, it cannot be the problem. It has to be used to solve problems. So which brings us to the comprehensible input piece, which is really crucial because we're teaching in our classrooms in the target language, And when we talk about comprehensible input, that doesn't mean that the students understand every single word we say, but they're getting the gist of what's going on. Sometimes it's a gradual increase, depending on how we raise the bar on them as we are getting them to comprehend even more and more. So I always think of, when we talk about 90% of the target language, it has to be comprehensible target language, because I can speak 100% target language, but it loses its value when they don't have any clue of what's going on. So I always say, we have to make sure the input is comprehensible. And if we ignore the comprehensible piece, then the 90% loses its value, because the whole point of 90% plus is that they can stay engaged in what's happening, because there really is no input happening if they're not understanding any of it. But again, letting them know errors are obligatory, which means errors can be receptive as well, not just productive. And it's okay for them to misunderstand, because guess what? They're probably not going to understand everything when they're not in the classroom and they're actually immersed in a situation with native speakers who may not know the English language. So, and I always say, I always like to think of it as just go for 100% target language. Granted, you might have to spend your 10%, and it's a good question. How do you spend your 10%? If you're not gonna stay in the target language 100%, then how are you spending that 10%? Which begs the question, when you're planning, you need to plan deliberately for what is for that comprehensible input piece. Deliberately planning for that comprehensible input piece. It doesn't happen by chance. You need to make sure, we always want to make sure that we have all these pieces in place when we're planning. Let's talk about how we get them to understand it for a second. So the frequent checks for understanding, that is like very crucial to making it comprehensible. So we can use verbal strategies, or we can use nonverbal strategies, or a combination of both. So for nonverbal strategies could be just the thumbs up, thumbs down. Facial expressions. We can read the student's body language. We can have them hold up cards or whiteboards or some type of electronic device, but you can have giving them symbols where, like, question mark, I don't understand that, or whatever symbols you pick. And we'll hit on some insert cards later of how I use those with the listening and the reading as well. Verbal strategies, either blank or blank. Turn and talk. Think, pair, share. So these are ways, where they have to actually say things, and you can do your check for understanding with that. Numbered heads together, and by the way, I'm going to later I'm going to give you all a link to a lot of these strategies. So hang in there. Having no input, you will not have output. So we already know this, that we want to have input for them to get the output piece. So comprehensible language, context, and interactions. You might have to paraphrase new words and expressions. Define new words with examples rather than translation. Slow down the rate of speech according to the level of the learners, using their vocabulary and structures that they know, and then they can build on them over time. Using new words and expressions more than twice. So you want to constantly use them over and over again, or re-enter it frequently in the input process. They won't immediately start outputting with this, but this is all part of the process. And the connected discourse rather than isolated words for drill and repetition. So, yes, gestures and visuals and prompts and cues, all these things are going to be what lead to these checks for understanding in the receptive mode of communication. So, how do we decide which vocabulary to teach? So that's the question that I want you to ponder and talk amongst yourselves if you're with a group, and share out, and I'll be curious to see what you all think on this, because I think it's an interesting question. How do we decide which vocabulary to teach? Okay, I'm unmuting now. My scroll bar was scrolled up, so I was wondering why nobody was responding, but it was because I had not scrolled down. So pardon me for not catching that. Here we go. There we go. Okay, and I just saw some other comments about the motivation piece, which was really interesting too. I liked how somebody mentioned the for some kids it's for future jobs as well. Okay, so how do we decide to teach vocabulary? So I see here, do you start with what you intend for them to do, and then we'll know what vocabulary and structures they need. And then, let's see, another one is we work with themes, so we give them vocab that will support the theme. And then it is important to have the vocabulary distributed by levels. Think about what they need to complete the task. Another one, Spotsylvania, backwards design from assessment, aligned vocabulary and grammar. Western branch, I use backward design too. Spotsylvania, personalized vocabulary for individual student relevancy. Bedford schools, we have a couple of thoughts here. One, what vocab applies to their interests and lives that they can use. Two, with themes, what vocab do we need to have in order to successfully communicate on the topic? Ocean Lakes High School, we do the vocabulary that is given to us in our curriculum, but we also keep up to date with real vocabulary that is seen in the world beyond the book. Fairfax, vocabulary comes from the curriculum, but also words the students ask for to personalize their lives. And I see that there's others that are still typing, so let's see, high frequency words from Hanover Public Schools. I love all the answers. So I think these are great answers, and I think, again, that interest piece was a really good, important point that's brought up. I'm thinking also of the literacy part of this as well. So are there cases where one learns without seeing a visual? Or how do we know when we're, I guess a better question to ask is, how do we know when we're underusing or overusing a visual? Because this is one of the things that, you know, through years of teaching, which many of us are, I guess, veteran teachers, I kind of realized. So I guess, you know, I think back to that study by ACTFL back in 2014, I think it was, that suggested that listening and reading skills are acquired more quickly than speaking skills. And in there, according to it, that listening proficiency developed more slowly than the reading. So the research supported the view that reading is a valuable way of acquiring knowledge, and that perhaps more exposure to the target language listening supported development of the productive speaking skills. So when we go back to the vocabulary piece, because as language educators, we facilitate language learning, not word learning, so we have to think about how we use images and how we use visuals. So an image has less value when there's no context. So we want there to be a context. But another question I think about is, can we consider giving keywords first by defining it, first by circumlocuting the word? I call it, I almost want to call it receptive circumlocution, if that's if that word even exists. But you know, the students productively circumlocute. So can the students receptively circumlocute? So so for example, before explaining something with gestures and visuals, to avoid the extra step of visual translation that sometimes occurs with visuals. So for example, if I immediately just start out with a picture of a word, then if the students look at that word, some students might still not have their mind in the target language, even though that's what the exposure in the classroom is, and they might see that visual, and the first word that comes to their mind, even though they're not saying it, might be their first language, language one. So before I show an image to confirm whether they understood it or not, perhaps a good way to do it is to first describe what the word is, and that's probably what many of us do, but I think it's a great way to approach sometimes with the vocabulary, how to see if they can acquire vocabulary from language and not be over-reliant on visuals. So one of the things I ask myself is, am I conditioning my students to be more dependent on the target language, the target language to learn the target language, or more dependent on pictures and gestures to learn the target language? So I almost want my students to become target language dependent to learn the target language. So how do we use our visuals, and how do we decide which vocabulary to teach? And I loved when you all said about, well, what do the students need? What do they want? That's one way, is what do you want? What do you need to be able to function? And the kids, you know, they'll tell you, and if we're not sure what they want, we can ask them, what interests you? What words do you need? And I love the part about the personalized vocabulary that some of you had mentioned as well, because, you know, once the students have a reason or a need for a word, then they're going to be more likely to produce with those words. So we're getting language production from that. And I heard the term helicopter teaching at ACTFL, so I thought, is there even an image that even exists out there for it? So I Googled the word helicopter teacher, and that image popped up, and I thought, huh, that's an interesting image. Maybe I can throw that in there. Because one of the things is, I always say to myself when I'm sitting down to plan a lesson, one of my driving questions or essential questions for planning and teaching, assessing is, how do I make myself less necessary in the classroom? So one of the things is, I don't want to create a group of learners that are flashcard dependent. I want them to be target language dependent learners. So, you know, I remember when, you know, some of my learning experiences when I was younger with language, you know, I would be in a classroom where the teacher was just doing verb conjugation, and you would see like these words, the verb endings, and you would have like this color, the stem, this color, and that's great for some of those visual learners, but for me, who is not a visual learner, I was more of an auditory learner. It was just like, it didn't make sense to me seeing these colors. That why is this ending in a different color? And then when I would go to try to read something, like, because I used to like to try to read like the newspaper in Spanish or whatever, they didn't have all those colors that I was getting exposed to in my classroom. There was no colors like what the teacher was exposing me to. So I think when we use the flashcards, which is fine, you know, to a certain degree, we also need to ask ourselves, how are we using the visuals? How are we using the flashcards? Are we using them in the way where the students are becoming more dependent on target language to learn the target language, or are we just creating flashcard dependent learners? Because they're not going to be getting flashcards when they're out in the real world. They're going to be encountering the language. So again, are there cases where one learns words without seeing them, or one learns words without hearing them? So we need to have a careful balance with how we're using those visuals. And again, what many of you were saying about the personalized vocabulary is the fact that, you know, are the students getting any voice and choice in what they're learning?
Good afternoon. The time is now 5 o'clock. If you're ready.
Sorry, there's an announcement in my school right now.
Remember, activity must leave promptly at 5:15. Thank you.
Okay, so again, with the vocabulary lists, why not have the students personalize what they want to learn? And that's a really important thing. So this is part of creating a discourse community in our classrooms, is the students' ability to be able to say what they don't know how to say. And And so, you know, one of the things that is a neat strategy to do in the classroom is something like an unending definition. So, for example, you could give the students the word, for example, kitchen, and then another student might, or then a student will say, give the definition, a kitchen is a place where you prepare food, and obviously all this in the target language. Then another student, then you'll ask, well, what is food? And another student might answer, food is something you eat. And then you just keep it going, and then you might do another word the same way. Because what this does is it gets them using words or words, talking around words they may not know. It helps them with definition creation, but in a way that will support their development and their ability to circumlocute in the target language. Oops, let me slide one more. There we go. Oops. I think I got ahead of myself. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. There we go. I want to make sure I'm on the correct slide. Okay, so very good. Oh, I see this slide here. Whoops. Go back right here. Very good. Okay, so back to the vocabulary. Let's talk about grammar for a second. You know, for those of you who may not be Spanish teachers, because I'm a Spanish teacher, so I use a Spanish example here, ¿Cómo te llamas?, which would be a way you would want to find out someone's name. ¿Cómo te llamas? What's your name? Or directly, how do you call yourself? Me llamo. I call myself. And it's a reflexive verb in the present tense. So, do they really need to learn how to conjugate a reflexive verb in the present tense to be able to communicate the question, what's your name? And answer the question, my name is. And I think all of us would say, no, you do not have to be able to say, I call myself, you call yourself, he calls himself, she calls herself, we call ourselves, they call ourselves, because that's not what we would want in a can-do statement on a learning plan. You know, so I always think to myself, you know, when I'm doing my can-dos, is this something that they need, and is it something that they'll actually use outside my classroom, or is it content that may confuse them? So a level 1 student doesn't need to necessarily know that. A level 2 student doesn't necessarily know it's a reflexive verb. It's communication. It's, I can tell people my name. I can ask others my name. So our can-dos should not be focused on the grammar, but on a real world purpose. So one of the things that I remember Laurel Terrell saying with respect to learning plans was, you know, she said, you know, if it's an interpersonal task, have the conversation that your students are going to have at the end of that learning episode. Go through that conversation that your students are going to have in that learning episode. And that will help you establish what it is that you want the students to know, understand, and be able to do. So I always thought that was a really good piece of advice, and it's always stuck in the back of my mind, and I follow that, you know, have the conversation, have the do the presentation in your mind, or obviously you do the reading, so you know what it is that the students need to know and be able to do. So you know, that's a really important piece in that learning process. Now, we talked about input and we talked about output, and I was going back and forth. Is it NO input, NO output, or is it KNOW input or KNOW output? Because I think they both kind of work in a way. So are the students in our classes, are they learning how to read? Are they learning how to listen? And are we moving them are we shifting it and moving them along where they're reading to learn and listening to learn in the target language? So that brings us to that literacy piece. So what things can we do to support literacy in our classrooms? Because this also supports their path to proficiency. Well, you know, we want to hook them with something that's interesting. And we want to go with something that's with prior knowledge, something they're familiar with, something they can connect with. So, you know, for example, in a social studies class, they might, if they're going to be doing, talking about the Boston Tea Party, you're not going to ask them the question, what's the Boston Tea Party? Because that's not something that would be prior knowledge. But something that everybody could connect with would be, have you ever been treated unfairly? So we want to start with what is known to the students rather than content questions. So we want to activate their thinking. So one of the neat ways to do that is using an anticipation guide. So before doing a reading or before doing a listening, I would even say before doing a speaking. So any type of activity, you could have them do an agree, disagree. And again, we could do thumbs up, thumbs down. So it doesn't have to be done in a checkbox format. It could be done where the teacher says it out loud or where the students read it off a sheet of paper, depending on what your intent was. Because everything we do when we plan and teach is with an intention. Think alouds. This is really important, and it's something that I love to do. I call them read aloud, think alouds. I call them listen aloud, think alouds. So basically, this is when the teacher comments on how to think. Because we can't assume that all students know how to think when they're reading, or that all students know how to think when they're listening to something. So sometimes it's good for the teacher to model out loud what's going on in their brain as they're reading something. I mean, this is the perfect opportunity to point out root words of cognates. You know, my students already know that if they know one word, then they know all words. And I know that's an exaggeration, but you know, it gets them to start being aware of the fact that they can use their prior knowledge to learn more. So if they know the word student, then they might understand the word study, studious. So this is like the think alouds are what give us that opportunity to model this thinking as we're reading. So the kids can say, oh wait, that's how I'm supposed to be thinking when I read. So once we've established that they understand that, you know, then you go back and you reread it now that they understand it. Same thing with the listening. Pause and tell the students what it is you're thinking when you're listening to that. This is when you're developing their listening skill and their reading skill, because that's going to help lead them to the point where they can actually read to learn and listen to learn. But they have to first learn how to read and learn how to listen before they can read to learn and read to listen. So I think it's important to read aloud, think aloud. And if there's any questions at any point, please feel free to chime in, because if I'm going on too long without giving you a mental break to think about this, just chime in. Feel free to ask a question. Inserts. I think I mentioned inserts. With the inserts, again, this doesn't have to be just with reading. And I will always say limit it to three symbols. I think it becomes overwhelming to students if you're going to tell them to use 5 different symbols. But so an example here that's on the screen would be, when they're reading, you could say, if it's a really interesting point, the exclamation point means how, que interesante, or a question mark is no comprendo, so these symbols help them monitor their comprehension. It makes them aware of what they do not understand. And back to the read aloud, think alouds, one thing I love to do, especially, you don't have to teach a lesson on object pronouns It doesn't have to be about grammar. So for example, when you're doing a think aloud or read aloud, think aloud, that's your perfect opportunity to point out those direct object pronouns that so they know there's a context to that, and they're receptively starting to see and hear and read these object pronouns. They don't need to be taught direct object pronouns and indirect object pronouns to be able to know it, to understand them. And we use these read alouds and think alouds to expose them to these concepts that don't have to be about grammar, but about a message. They're about a message. Back to the inserts, hold-up cards. You can do the hold-up cards with these symbols. Listening and with reading. And I think it's great when you do it with listening, because if there's key information you want them to listen for, when you go to play it back again, those kids that didn't really get it and won't tell you they didn't get it, this is their chance to get it, because they'll see their classmates raising their hand or raising the card, and they'll tune in on that, and they'll be like, oh wait, now I hear it. I just needed somebody to point it out for me at that time. These things help the students with all abilities. I think this is one of the most important things we can do as teachers of languages. Proof for, proof against. So they can find information in a text or find information from on a reading, and so you give the statements, then they can find proof for it or proof against it. Same thing with like fact or opinion. I love fact or opinion. You know, find the facts in there, find opinions, and they can make 2 categories with that. So there's all kinds of things you can do with the literacy piece that can engage the students and get them thinking in the target language about texts that are in the target language. And this also supports their success, not just in the world language classroom, but other classes as well. Reflection. So this was adapted from the LinguaFolio VBCPS and StarTalk binder reflection that we used in the program here in Virginia Beach. It's a good way to get students to be thinking about their own approach to listening and reading. So as you can see here, you know, I don't have to read the whole thing to you, but when listening, I know why I'm listening. I listen for words when others talk to me. So this is something you can give to students, not necessarily just after they've done it, but sometimes if you give students these reflections before they actually do it, it'll change the way they actually will go about listening to it when it comes time to listen to it. So I always say you can do pre-reflection and post-reflection. It doesn't always have to be post-reflection. And I found that sometimes the pre-reflection has helped accelerate their acquisition of, you know, comprehension in the language, as well as speaking. I can't overemphasize the importance of playbacks. From my own experience, this was really great, but as a learner, when I was in my Spanish classes, I always remembered sometimes, you know, the teacher, we would do a listening, and finally when I was like, oh yeah, now I understand it, and then it's like, okay, let's go on to the next one. And I used to think to myself, wait, don't do that, don't do that. I want to know now what it feels like to understand when I'm listening. Kids need to know that. They need to know what it feels like to understand, because if they always feel like they're playing catch up, then they can start to become discouraged, I believe. So, and you'll see the kids, they get their eyes light up when they're like, oh yeah, I understand it now. And it's great, and it does bring up their comprehension. So I always think of it as, I don't understand. Now I understand after it's been pointed out and played back. I'm understanding better. I've just listened again or read again. I'm understanding. So you can never really do too many readbacks or playbacks. So that's some of the literacy skills that I would like to highlight. But we've got to hook them. And I think culture is a great way to do that. So I always like to think of the fact that, the language and the culture, they can't be separated. They go together. They cannot be separated. They must go together. And I love this image here, that has more of the, I guess the tangible culture is what you see at the top, but what about the intangible cultural aspects, those perspectives? And so when we read or listen to something, we don't just stop at comprehension. We want to also go into the cultural piece, like what is a perspective here? And is this perspective similar to your perspective or not, or the community you live in or not? And culture is not just about differences. Culture is also about similarities. So we want to hook them with culture. So in all three modes, using imagery, again, visuals, 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 not necessarily a flashcard of just an item, but a context. Because again, a visual with a context is going to have more meaning to the students than just a visual of just an object. So if you show a visual, you could have them tell you, what do I see? What do I think about what I see? What do I wonder? So even today I used a visual, and so the students were asked to say, to tell me what they saw, and they were speaking amongst themselves in their pairs, what they saw in the visual, then what they thought, and then they had to come up with, what questions do you have about the visual? And that's what led into a video clip that they watched. So I think this is a great way to hook them in. So asking them, what's going on in the picture? What do you see that makes you say that? And what more can we find? And you can use, what do you wonder about it? And you can use the hierarchy of questions. Yes or no? Which? Either or. So we use those hierarchy of questions of who, what, when, where, why, how. Can you describe? So depending on where they are in this process is what questions you ask. Can you tell me about da-da-da? What if da-da-da? Imagine the conversation between those two students in that classroom. So, there's a lot of things you can do. And so with the interpersonal would be that, have the conversation of the two people in there. With the presentational, you could have them compare your community with one in the image, or compare your classroom with the one in the image. Oh, I don't see a Promethean board. I don't see computers. I don't see. So this is really important. So let's see if we have any questions. So should questions and answers on a listening assessment be in the target language? That's a good question. In the more novice, because with the receptive skill, when you're assessing a receptive skill, there are a lot of thoughts out there that sometimes the students, if they don't understand the question that's being asked, did they get it? Is the inaccuracy in their answer due to the fact that they didn't understand the text, or is the inaccuracy due to the fact that they did not understand the question that's being asked? So I would say in your lower level classes, English would probably be where you'd want to go with receptive skill, because you're assessing a receptive skill. So the target language, the source that they're reading is in the target language, so they're getting receptive target language there. So I would say, yeah, your 10% would be in the, your 10% would be that question to assess their reading and listening skill for a novice level. Now when you're getting more into the upper levels, especially in your AP courses, obviously they're going to be in the target language, because that would be more level appropriate for those students, and they need to be able to understand higher level questioning to be successful, not just participating at university level course, but also when they take the AP exam, that's the format that that assessment is done in, which would be appropriate because these are AP students. So to answer your question clearly, I would say more in the novice levels, you're going to want to stay with questioning in English, but for a receptive skill. And then of course in the upper levels in the target language. But again, you want to scaffold in the questions. So if they're formulaic type questions as they progress towards the upper levels, you would scaffold in what are typical questions like, ¿Cuál es el propósito? What is the purpose of this reading? So once they know what these questions are formulaically, then yeah, and as they progress in the upper levels, you would give those questions in the target language. I hope that answered the question. If not, please clarify or ask for clarification on that. But it is a good question. I'm glad you asked that because I think that's an important question. Feel free if there are any other questions. And I think I already mentioned about having the conversation that they will have. So we shifted the focus of lesson can-dos away from teaching vocabulary to focus instead on sentence level production. And having that conversation, what do I want them to talk about at the end of this lesson, and have that conversation. So, as I mentioned, we don't want just images of words, but we want images of contexts. So, for example, you can have fun with the images, and the images. Sometimes the images may not be explicit culture. And remember, culture is my community and the target language community. So the students can't ignore their community in language learning because that's the community they live in. And they'll encounter target language communicating opportunities within their own communities as well. So when you can use visuals also, target language culture video, target language cultural images, and maybe community, the students' community images as well. And the kids, so for example, there's a popular image that was circulating on, I guess it might have been on Instagram or whatever, which I used, as you can see, it's that top image there of the guy walking with his friend or girlfriend, and he turns around and the kids are like, they react. But sometimes when you get emotional involvement, and again, it has to be age appropriate, but for high school kids, they see this image, they're seeing this image. No, I wouldn't use this image in a elementary level program or even middle school, but in high school this image was age appropriate. And so what was the point of the image? Well, what were they doing when he turned around? What do you see? What do you wonder? What questions do you have? So again, it gets them to be using, for example, in this particular one, it was for them to tell about what somebody was doing when somebody else saw something, or when somebody else turned around to look at a friend, or what was he looking at? Well, he was looking at her shoes, is what one person said. And so, and how did what did the girl say to him? So again, it got them talking about something, and they were engaged in the image. They had fun talking about this image. The other image was a cruise ship. Well, that really did happen. It was a cruise ship that had, sunk. But it was an interesting image for the class because they wanted to tell about what they were doing on that cruise when it sank. So, it was so funny because you have fun with the language. So when they were doing it, I softly put music. I put the instrumental version of the Titanic song playing in the background. So it was just very, very soft in the background, just to get them like engaged in the moment. And they were like, when they were telling about what they were doing when the cruise ship sank or had an accident, they're telling in a very serious tone, like they're on a documentary. And they had so much fun with that. They wanted to do it again the following class. So, so we can have fun with the images, especially when there's a context to look at. So we talked about our receptive skill checks for learning. In the interpersonal mode, we have our checks for learning there. So, you know, and I'm going to give you all, like I said earlier, I'm going to show you a site where you'll find even more classroom activities. So exchange information in a lineup. So for example, it could be in an inner or outer circle. That's a way to check for interpersonal check for learning. Ask your partner a question. Ask a follow-up question. State your opinion and find out your partner's opinion. Draw what your partner describes. Ask clarifying questions, or write a question I could ask to find out something. And then, of course, you can call on, you know, a sample of randomly to ask question. Call on, you know, a sample of learners to ask and answer a question. One of the things I like to do, which you'll see later, is require my students to be ready when called on, and I'm going to share with you some of the stuff I do with that. But take a moment and share your own checks for learning in the interpretive or interpersonal modes. So I'm just going to give you a mental break for a minute to talk amongst yourselves about any check. And you know, if you don't have anything that come to mind at the moment, that's fine too, because I can just move on to the presentational, because I'm looking at the time. It's almost 5:30, so. With the presentational checks for learning, you could do things where students brainstorm words in the you know, for example, in the novice level, they could brainstorm words on particular topics or images that you have. They could tell a story. They could write about the graphics that you're showing. And again, with presentational, that could be with your, you know, entrance and exit tickets. And then if you get involved in a lot of technology, I know probably Heidi's out there, and I'm sure that she probably does a lot with the technology with students, maybe having them tweet out something that, you know, summarizes something. So these are some presentational checks for learning, and I'm sure Heidi probably could give tons of technology ideas on this, because I've seen her presentations, and she's got some great ideas with that as well. So now what I'm going to do, we're going to take a minute and explore some classroom activities, and some of these activities get students a chance to get out of their seats as well. So here's a site I just gave that's on the slide here, and it's the Star Talk slide, and I don't know exactly, you know, because I've never presented on a webinar format. So if you click on the link, or if you can't click on it, if you go onto your browser and find this, when it takes you to that page, if you look at the resources tab, you can scroll down to classroom activities, and this is the Star Talk site. And you know, this was one of the resources that Jen Carson and I shared when we presented on the Star Talk effect at the ACTFL 2019 conference in Washington, D.C. And in there you have, you know, you have classroom activities for the interpretive mode, interpersonal mode, and presentational mode. And not only do they have the different activities that you, whichever one's interested, you click on. When you click on it, it'll take you to the actual instructions on how to do that particular how to do that particular activity, along with some helpful tips, and then of course ways to differentiate with that, and of course the materials they'll give you. So it's a really great resource. And if you're like, I still would like to see how it works, they also provide video footage of classrooms that are taught in the target language that are using that particular strategy. So I'm going to give you all a minute or two to just kind of explore that at your sites. And you know, if you see something you really like, just kind of shout out what you liked, or if there's anything that you find interesting, feel free to share your thoughts on this, and I'll pause my If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to at least look and see what's all in there, and it's a great resource. And you know, I got this because I learned about it working as the Star Talk curriculum instruction specialist during the summer months in our school district, and I think it's a great resource. Our teachers in the program use it, and I think that, you know, if you're a coordinator or instructional specialist, and you know, you might want to share this with your teachers, and of course the teachers out there hopefully will find this as a useful resource. So moving on, I'd like to know what you all think. What is the difference between practicing and producing? What is the difference between practicing and producing? So talk amongst yourselves for a minute, and I'd like to see just a few people respond to that question. So I'm going to give you 1 minute And I'm seeing some really, really good answers. This is a great group. Practicing is scaffolding, and producing is usually the end goal communication. Memorizing, reciting versus creating something new. Practicing is guided, scaffolded, and producing is more spontaneous, output, performance. Practicing is rehearsing, and producing is using your knowledge to create. And of course, from our site here in Ocean Lakes High School, practicing is the process to eventually obtain producing, which is the result. Going from knowledge to creation. Gosh, all these answers, I think we could all write a book. Practicing does not require students to really understand the language. It can just be repeating what the teacher has said to adequate pronunciation, tone, etc. Whereas producing means to be able to communicate a use of original language. And use, yeah, I see. And use of original language. Very good. Pardon the typo. I like that. So, yeah, and I think these are just perfect answers. And of course, we know the gradual release of responsibility is teacher, I do, modeling, teacher, student, we do. Then student collaboratively do, so they're guided. And then of course, independently. So in the image here, you see the teacher on the stage really big. Then you see the teacher get a little bit smaller, and you see the teacher get a little bit smaller, and you see the teacher get really, really small. And now the students are big, and they're the ones on the stage. And it was a great, it's a great image of gradual release of responsibility that I caught during Greta Lunsford's presentation in at the ACTFL conference. So I thought this is a great illustration of how the gradual release of responsibility occurs. And so this is one of the things that I always say, you know, you're probably saying, what do scissors have to do with this? Well, what I do is I pick the scissors because my students know what it means when they see the scissors come out. In fact, I have it right here in my classroom. I spin it. It spins perfectly. So you spin the scissors, and it's very random. So the point is, group work, pair work is not successful until every member has learned what it is they need to be able to do and has helped in some way. And so therefore that, students individually have to be held accountable despite the group work. So I would say that students need to have something to bring to the group before you let them be in groups. And also the randomness, after they've collaborated, there needs to be a spinning of the scissors or whatever random way you have, drawing straws, to have the students show that they're ready when called on. So the accountability piece has to be there for there to be development of proficiency. So you could have everyone write something, then certify the correctness of all the papers, and then you might just pick one to highlight in front of the class, or listen and watch students as they take turns practicing, or assigning roles or different jobs for different students. So there needs to be that accountability piece for this, for the acquisition to work. That said, being that we still have 20 minutes, I'm going to share a few more strategies with you that can develop students on their path to proficiency. So we talked about cultural images. You can get infographics. I know that you all probably get them in your classes where you'll get them off Pinterest or whatever places that you might see. And if you know of, I'm sorry, I see that when I said Greta, I mispronounced her name. It's Greta Lundgaard, and she presented at ACTFL and shared the image, and it was a great image, and So I wanted to make sure I gave her credit where credit was due on that. So in back to this infographic here. So what is the question? So for example, you can put up an image, and again, this has cultural information on it, and the students could ask questions. So depending on the level, SB level appropriate, where the students might ask, what is the temperature in Paris? What is the weather in Rome? How much does the coffee cost in Paris? How much does the coffee cost in Rome? So it gets them starting to use questioning, techniques. So use images for questioning. Now, one of my favorite things is the hot seat. Now, with the hot seat, I used to mainly use it principally for students to, pick, like if they're in a group of 3, you might have one student be on the hot seat and answer all the questions of the other 2 students. And everybody's actively engaged. They have to be listening because they can't repeat a question that's already been asked. But I thought, how can we extend the hot seat to something they've read or something they watched, an audiovisual piece? So I would say it doesn't always have to be about them. Sometimes it can be about something they read, something they saw, something they heard. And it gives them an opportunity to ask those who, what, when, where, and why questions that we want to get them doing, that they do in their everyday life, outside the classroom. Oh, and by the way, when you're doing the previous one that I showed you with these slides, you can extend that into having students give personal responses, go delve deeper, whether it be into text or into images, and ask students any range of personal responses to any infographic. So, for example, what did you find interesting? What information do you doubt? What information would you like to share? Who would you share it with? So I always think that we don't just stop at comprehension. We don't just stop at the surface, but we want to go dig in deeper. So I always say, go deeper with reading, go deeper with images, and I think that the students will be more engaged. They'll find it more interesting, I think, in many ways when they get to expand on text. Another thing is encourage students to read news articles or things that interest them from publications that you can easily find online, and let them pick the ones they want to read. You don't have to pick them for them. And have them present it in their own words to a partner. So sometimes that requires them not being able to have the article in front of them, because otherwise they might end up parroting and just rereading it out loud, and we don't want that. We want them to actually have to create with the language. So then they could have a question and answer period between their partners that could follow. So they share the article information, then they can question and answer. And then the next day, and then you could have, another thing you could have them do is the other person who was taking notes while the person who shared the article. So you have the person who shares what their article was about, the other person could take notes and ask questions for clarification. Then you could have them say, now share with somebody else what your partner just shared with you. So then you have that accountability piece as well. And the next day you could have the other person come in with an article. So when students listen and take notes, you have that accountability piece there as well. Sentence starters. So you don't use all of these, but you could pick 1 or 2 that you'd want the students to be able to use. So in a novice level classroom, like we said, if they're novice speakers, that does not mean they are novice thinkers. So we have to give them those sentence starters. We have to scaffold for them so they can actually do some of these things that that they wouldn't be able to do if you didn't provide them with that, whether it be a placemat with sentence starters or just putting up on a Promethean board. My classroom is all windows. It's just all windows all the way around. I mean, completely. So, you know, I don't have much space to really put word walls up in my classroom. So sometimes what I have to do is put a slide up with the sentence starters, you know. And again, like I said, placemats can work as well. So if you're a teacher that travels from room to room, just have placemats, and that will help you get by. Because I know everybody has different circumstances. So make a prediction. I won't read them all to you, but you know, give them phrases like, I predict that da-da-da, you know, or I wonder if da-da-da. So you can give these phrases in the target language, like asking a question, like, why did da-da-da-da-da, or who is da-da-da. Do you think that, and then they could finish the statement, based on whatever the reading or listening selection or audiovisual resource was. I can see da-da-da when I read da-da-da. So these are, you know, I can hear, I can feel, I can smell. Again, back to the senses. I always say text is sense, is senses. So it's not just reading, it's not just listening. Making a connection. I'm going to just kind of go through these quickly because you have access to this PowerPoint. I shared it. It's been shared, so you know you can reference this as needed. Clarify something. You can make up your own. Like it's really cool when da-da-da says, you know. So you can give them your own phrases, making an evaluative comment. And of course, you know, again, remember I said that accountability piece. When they come in to do a speaking activity, they need to come in prepared. Because if they come in with nothing, they may end up not contributing anything. So, you know, if they're going to talk about a reading or something, you know, their main ideas, they need to already have that already jotted down or prepared, their comments, any evidence from the text, and questions they might have. And that will produce, that'll have a more productive Socratic seminar where they're conversing, whether it be a roundtable format or whatever fits for your classroom. Am I going too fast? So these are some more Socratic seminar starters, which you already just saw. So, let's see here. So I'm not sure I understand the question, but these sentence starters are on the slides, which are shared, and you can translate them to your target language. Let's see. Okay, coffee talk. Here we go. So, how do students use reflection, assessment, and feedback as a bridge to proficiency? So I'm going to give you a second to talk amongst yourselves. And, oh, I see the question clarified. How do we access PowerPoint? I think, okay. So, you know, I shared the PowerPoint, and it will, what? So probably when you get your certificates, they're going to give you the access to the PowerPoint. So that way you can, you know, use these to come up with your own, or, you know, use them in your own target language that you teach. So take 1 minute and just kind of share with us how do students use reflection, assessment, and feedback as a bridge to proficiency? So let's talk about that. Just chime stuff I want to close with. I'm going to flip back to the Socratic seminar slide upon request from Fairfax County Public Schools, as you all are talking about how do students use reflection, And by the way, if you Google like Socratic's or even just sentence starters, you'll find tons more that are probably even better than the ones that I'm sharing with you today. It all depends on what your need is for your particular classroom. So, and if you find some and, can share them, that would be great too. I imagine there's probably somewhere everybody can share materials that. So, and it's okay if you don't necessarily have a thought on this, or maybe you're still thinking about this, but how do students use reflection, assessment, and feedback as a bridge to proficiency? So I want to see what Fairfax is typing before I move on. They see how they can improve and set goals. I love that answer. It's very good. I say that's really good, and it's lending itself towards the reflective piece. Fantastic. So one of the things I always will, after we do something in class, we always have a reflective piece where, what did you learn? What did you contribute? And how will you apply your learning from today's lesson or today's session? And that's a really important part of the learning. So, for example, anytime, especially like if they've done a roundtable discussion, what did you contribute? What questions did you ask? So you can vary these. You can say, what questions did you ask today? And that's an exit ticket. Okay, so these are great ways to get the students to be reflecting on their own learning. Because if they're not reflecting on their own learning, they're not going to be able to track their own growth. And as a result, you won't see as much growth as you would otherwise. And yes, we do give students feedback. And I think that student feedback, student to student is great, but student self-feedback is even better. And the reason why I say that is because if you give students an opportunity to speak or write or whatever skill it is that you're assessing, it's always good to let them see a student sample that would be model samples, because that way they can understand and track their own growth. And they're empowered by that. And so I always say student samples, student samples, student samples, in addition to the teacher oral corrective feedback that we give. But teacher oral corrective feedback without student reflection doesn't have as much value as it would if the students have reflection. So I think that is just so crucial to the whole piece, is giving students the tools to track their own growth, and the way to do that is through seeing samples of the work. I love the comment made from the ODU offsite, which is, yes, student samples allow learners to set their own goals for growth and self-assess. That needs to be published, and that needs to be tweeted, because that is exactly right on the target. I couldn't have said it better. So, we have 5 minutes left, and I just want to see if there's any other interpretive, interpersonal, presentational. I've got tons of slides I have come prepared in case it were 4 o'clock and I got to this point, which it's not. It's 5:55, so we have 5 minutes. So I'm just going to kind of see if there's anything else that you might be able to pick up from these slides. So again, we talk about the imagery. So before students do a reading, you can show a photo from an article that you want them to read or listen to, and the students could talk about the image and make predictions of what they think it's going to be about. And then later they can confirm it after they've read it. Speed dating is a classic, which I know everybody already knows this, so I probably won't spend much time on this slide, but you know, you can give them things to talk about and give them a time limit, and they talk to another student. And again, we mentioned earlier that we have the inner outer circle, and a lot of this stuff you'll find on different sites that have resources similar to the StarTalk site that I shared with you. Role playing is always great, but again, you have to keep it real. So I don't necessarily like the image I chose on this slide because, you know, most sixth graders are not yet doctors, but you would need to adjust it to your audience. What would be the role play about? So again, you could always talk about that. Imagine the conversation. So again, that would be interpersonal mode. Now, going back to the vocabulary, we talked about prior knowledge, and I said to you that you have to, that with prior knowledge, you know, the students, once they learn one word, they know many words. So you can expand that. Once they know a word, have them give the definition of that word in their own terms. This is the Freyer model that I know most of you probably use or are familiar with. Facts and characteristics, examples, non-examples, and at a novice level, they could draw a picture. So same thing with, you know, receptively, they could point to pictures if there's a question about listening. If you have images on a sheet of paper, you could say, have them indicate what image represents what you're listening to or what you're reading. So there's all kinds of things there. So what I'm going to do, we have like 3 minutes left. So you're going to have access to these slides. And what I want to do is see if there are any questions before we conclude, because we have like 3 minutes left. So if you have any questions or suggestions as far as like what we could do in our own classrooms, interpersonal, presentational, or interpretive. Oh, yes, I'll show you this link here, and it works. I like the word groovy. Some groovy resources. And it is shared like in a public way, because I had to change the setting on it from, I shared this slide when I presented at FLAVA, and I'm going to ask Shirley, if I add more resources to this slide, would it automatically populate? Yeah. Okay, so if so what I'll do is, as I stumble across more resources, I'll add them on then, and that way it grows, because I actually have more stuff I could share than what's on this one too, and there's quite a bit there. So any other questions before we stop? We have like 1 minute, and this has been great. I've enjoyed presenting today, and I hope you found the information useful. I tried to hit on theory, practice, and I also tried to hit on approach. So to sum it up, the principles are what determine our approach, which determines our practices. So, you know, as long as we have those pieces in place, we'll keep doing the right thing. As long as we're doing can-dos, we'll keep doing the right things in our classes. So keep doing those can-dos, keep up those great principles that all of you just have demonstrated to me that you already have. I don't doubt that any of you all could have done this presentation as well, because I can see from the comments. So thank you for all of your sharing, and I hope you took something away from this that might be helpful, or brought back something that you might want to keep doing or try doing next time. So thank you everybody for your time, and have a great evening.